There are 38 playable killers in Dead by Daylight, and more are added every single year. Throughout DBD's lifespan, we've seen killers that can shapeshift, create portals, wield a gun, and some killers that don't even have a power. We've seen behavior give massive reworks for out-of-date or just generally weak killers like the Doctor and Freddy, again. But it's really nice to see behavior give updates to some of these characters who have fallen behind due to the constantly shifting meta of the game. However, with every new killer added, it gets harder and harder for behavior to give attention to each one. Unfortunately, leaving some killers in the dust for years before getting a rework to make their power up to par with the newer releases. That being said, there are a few killers that just haven't gotten the love they desperately need. Killers with powers that just don't feel as fluid and pleasant to use as the newer killers that come out today. In fact, one killer in particular is so behind on getting some love that he feels really clunky to play, despite receiving the odd change here and there. A killer who behavior has stated is completely fine where he's at, despite being one of the weakest killers in the game. You all read the title, you know exactly where this is headed. Today, we're talking about the Trapper. Back in 2016, Trapper was one of the top 3 killers in the game, because there were only like 3 killers in the game. Back then, Trapper did the exact same thing he does now. Deny loops by placing traps at windows and pallets, forcing survivors into dead zones or unsafe loops where you have an easier time downing them. Once you down them, hook them in a place you know you can easily defend with traps. If survivors are smart, they'll most likely leave the person on hook and focus on doing generators. If not, they'll rush in for the save and get caught in your brilliantly placed traps or something like that. Trapper can be surprisingly good at snowballing and securing multiple downs as long as you place your traps strategically. It's easy to lock down one side of the map and keep a tight grasp on all the generators and hooks, making it a challenge for even some of the best teams to get all 4 to escape, assuming you know what you're doing. Trapper's biggest downside is the communication between survivors. If you're going against a decent survive with friends who gives constant calls to the location of your traps and where you've set up, you're most likely going to lose unless you have a plan, like get add-ons or get a basement hook or something like that. Trapper's gameplay is actually really interesting because it relies on decent map knowledge and prediction of survivor movements, making him surprisingly fun to play at times, assuming you have a good understanding of the game you're playing. Which is where my problems with Trapper begin. I love Trapper. I really do. I think he can be a fun challenge to try to win with. Playing him feels like a self-imposed hard mode, similar to playing like early Houndmaster or reworked Skull Merchant. You know you're going into a match with a higher chance of losing, but it can be really fun to overcome those odds. Unfortunately, the challenge of simply playing a killer itself isn't necessarily good design. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing bad about having killers you can't play in a traditional way. We have a ton of killers who have anti-loop powers where the gameplay can feel pretty repetitive. So it's nice to have a handful of killers that focus more on macro gameplay. Powers you have to set up ahead of time to get full value, like Hag, Singularity to an extent, Twins, or Skull Merchant before they executed her. Having killers designed around different gameplay styles isn't bad design in the slightest. In fact, DBD's survival sort of depends on it. However, having a killer so weak that the only really effective way to play him is to tunnel someone out or try to get them to die on the first hook isn't good design. Killers with similar gameplay styles, like, again, Hag, are at least strong enough to be able to engage with regular DBD gameplay. A Hag with good trap placement can still monitor gens, hook people multiple times, and end chases really quickly. Trapper just doesn't have the kit to do that. He needs to set up even more than Hag does despite being way weaker. Not only does he need to set up a network of traps, but he also has to collect them in advance. Without add-ons, he can only carry 2 traps at a time, as opposed to Hag having all her traps on loop. You have to go across the entire map to pick up traps and somehow set up an elaborate network before the survivors complete the objective, which he struggles to prevent due to his very basic power. I mean, he lacks lethality, map pressure, game slowdown, essentially everything that would make him a strong killer in today's meta, leaving Trapper mains with only the option to tunnel and proximity camp if they really care about winning. Let's be clear. Trapper hasn't been completely left in the dust by behavior. In fact, he's gotten a lot of really solid quality of life changes to his overall kit. A lot of aspects of his power have become less miserable to use and do actually feel somewhat fluid at times. Over the years, his trap pickup and placement animations have gotten considerably faster. Survivors can no longer break traps and just remove your power entirely. Traps spawn closer to generators to make pickup easier. It takes longer to escape traps, and some other things that make him a much more effective killer. So with all of those changes, why is he still so weak? Well, Trapper's design is very simple, which is great for newer players, but not so much for his overall strength. Once survivors understand what he does, which is really easy to do, they can plan around avoiding his traps entirely. As a survivor, Trapper's gameplay is really easy to counter. If you get hit, just run to wherever you spawned and you'll probably be in a trap-free zone, making the Trapper throw the match just to get a down on you if he really wants the hook. Because Trapper has no real chase power, he can't really commit to any chases unless there are traps nearby. This can lead to really boring gameplay for both sides. As Trapper, your only viable option is to defend generators around your web of traps, and as Survivor, you just have to hope your team doesn't get caught in those traps. Trapper can rely on some strong add-ons to make this easier, like the Eerie Stone or the Bloody Coil, but if the killer needs strong add-ons to win, that's not a good look. So, with all of this, why does Behavior claim that they're happy with where Trapper is? Well, in an official Reddit Q&A by Behavior, they stated the following.
It's been a topic of conversation across our teams, but at the moment, we do not have significant gameplay updates planned for Trapper. Partly because our data shows that his kill rate is pretty much where we want it to be on average even at high MMRs, but also because he holds a very important role as one of the simplest and easiest killers in the game. He's great for onboarding new killers and we don't want that to change too much.
I actually understand exactly where they're coming from with this post, even if I don't entirely agree with it. So first, let's talk about
The data.
Behavior loves their goddamn data. Every single time Behavior makes a bad change, it's because of their fucking data. So for those who don't know, Behavior uses data that they usually keep private to make a lot of decisions in terms of balance. You know that whole meme about Pig being nerfed despite being pretty weak? Yeah, that's because Pig was weak, but she has a high kill rate because of her traps, leading Behavior to think that she needs to be weaker, causing her to receive weird changes that don't make any sense without that context. Thankfully, they don't seem to do that as much anymore, but it can still be seen in a lot of their perk changes.
Oh, people are using a specific perk because it makes an annoying aspect of the game a little better? Time to nuke it into the ground.
This mentality can work for some things, like when perks are overused because they're too strong, like Old Maid for this, but sometimes it just doesn't make any sense. And anybody with a good amount of hours can tell you that Trapper is pretty damn weak, but because he's a free killer, and the first one on the roster at that, a lot of newer players pick him up, which I assume leads to more kills because at lower level, killer tends to be easier. Now, they do say that he has a good kill rate even at high MMR, which I'm not so sure about. Not only is MMR completely invisible to the players, but it's also not clear how much it affects matchups. At best, I'd say that the high MMR Trapper players are rare, which can lead to only the best people playing him, which would obviously cause that kill rate to seem decent. I'm not entirely sure about this because, like I said, all of this shit is private only to them. But they did say the kill rate was average and not great, so that's worth keeping in mind too. In addition, this post also doesn't state if they had any add-ons, which perks they were using, what map they were on, and any other variables that come with DBD. That being said, the kill rate is not enough to justify having an incredibly out-of-date killer whose design hasn't been effective in 7 years. As for the other part of this post, Behavior talks about Behavior, a specific dev that responded to this. I don't want to, this is obviously the opinions of everyone at Behavior. No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying Behavior as an encompassing term. Anyway, Behavior talks about Trapper being a simple entry point for new players, giving them a basic concept of how to play killer with an incredibly simple power and the necessity to engage with all aspects of DBD. This is actually where I kind of agree. Yes, it's incredibly important to have a starting point for new players because we all know that tutorials aren't doing that. They're awful. Generally speaking, the experience for new players getting on DBD for the first time isn't necessarily good. There are a lot of videos talking about why that is if you're interested, but we won't get too much into that. Trapper being a tryout killer for new players isn't a bad idea, but having him be so utterly weak at every other level just isn't healthy. I say, why can't he be both? Why can't Trapper be an easy killer to pick up, but also decently strong? After all, Trapper requires a lot of understanding of survivor movements and map knowledge to do well, and I'd hardly consider that to be beginner friendly. On top of that, Trapper being the most effective at trapping hooked survivors and forcing them to die on the first hook isn't the greatest representation of what DBD is about now. The game is about chases, hooking survivors multiple times, and getting the most use out of your perks. With Trapper, you just don't get that experience. I'd say that a lot of killers do a better job at introducing new players to the gameplay of DBD, while Trapper just shows them the worst aspects of it. Camping, tunneling, slugging, and getting destroyed by competent survivors because the killer isn't strong enough are all the most complained about parts of DBD. And having the first killer be so weak against anybody paying attention is just going to tell new players that that's what the game is about, so why would they want to keep playing? Behavior needs to give Trapper the same treatment they've given Freddy recently. Keep his identity as the Trapper intact, but make him far more representative of how the game is played nowadays. Make his power less aggravating to play as and against, and reinforce more interesting gameplay. Keep him simple, but make him really fun. Convince new killer players to try out different strategies on him to see the effectiveness of different perks and builds, sort of like a test dummy. Current Trapper just no longer represents the game he's been the poster boy of for the game's lifespan. That stopped being the case the second Behavior decided that they wanted to reinforce hooks over kills, like they should with the hook counter for killers when they updated the UI, or when they made hook stages longer very recently. There's nothing wrong with having trap-based killers, and I don't want anyone watching this video to think I want every killer to be a Wesker or a Bubba, but as every new killer these days comes out with the powers surrounded in chase abilities, why would the introduction killer have a gameplay style that feels so niche and clunky? I'm not saying he should have a chase power, but at the very least he should be far more fluid to use. Why not have traps and lockers for him to grab and balance the power around that aspect instead of forcing the Trapper players to explore every inch of the map? Whether you agree with me or not, you can't tell me you think Trapper is designed with the same thought and creativity as the newer killers of today. Killers like Wraith and Oni are fairly simple to understand, but are also decently strong and can hold their own against competent players without needing to use very rare or higher add-ons. Why can't Trapper be that way too? I'm worried that Trapper won't get love anytime soon and will continue to be a weak killer as long as Behavior doesn't see that he could really benefit from some changes. Due to his issues, and with Freddy receiving a rework, Trapper will probably be the weakest killer in the game, second only to the killer that Behavior intentionally killed, which really sucks. Even after many quality of life changes, Trapper remains a boring killer with an unsatisfying gameplay loop because his power is fundamentally outdated. And if Behavior refuses to address that, he will remain DBD's lost cause.